So Frederick Jackson, yeah. You need it. How we can do it? So we're going to check out his thesis and his argument. So what I really kind of want you guys focusing on is all those themes that we've been talking about. This one is about identity. How did Americans see themselves in the 1890s? What to them made America what it is? Does it have any similarities with the way we see America now? And I think one of the things we're going to do today is talk about some of those cultural similarities and really what does it mean, American culture? Because that's kind of a funky question that a lot of people have trouble answering. And we talked about this in September. I really don't like people who define culture as, you know, the food people eat and the dances they do. That's like the very surface area of culture, when culture is a lot deeper than that. So we're going to read, and let's check out Frederick Jackson Turner and his thesis. Lorna, would you like to start with
Narration bulletin of the superintendent of the census for 1890 appears in significant words.
What's a census?
Like what?
What's a census? Lorna, yeah?
Like, no. Like, I was thinking like almost like a survey. Like
it's a survey. It's exactly what it is. That the Constitution requires, it's one of the few things that the Constitution requires the federal government to do. Every 10 years, starting in 1790, and every 10 years thereafter, the government is required to count how many people live in the United States. For the purposes of, you know, how many House seats does the state get? You know, how does federal money get, you know? And in so counting, they find out millions of pieces of interesting information. And they can do, you know, it's through the census information that you see things like birth rates and where people were moving and economic mobility. And you look at an old census document, like from 1900, say, and it lists, you know, what language they speak at home, where their parents were from, what language do their parents speak at home, how long have they been in the United States, are they married, are they single, how many children do they have, how many children are alive, highest grade achieved. Like, so it's full of this really neat information. How much rent did you pay? How much money did you make this year? All of that's on the census documents. And as time has gone on, they've gotten more complex. You know, before 1850, they were pretty simple, and you know, since then they've gotten more interesting. So basically, this is the counting of all the people in America in 1890. Keep reading. Appear these significant words.
Up to and including 1880, the country had a frontier of settlement, but at present the unsettled area has been so broken into by isolated bodies of settlement that there can hardly be said to be a frontier line. In the discussion of its extent, its westward movement, etc., it cannot, therefore, any longer have a place in the census report.
What does that mean, and why is it so unusually weird? What's gone from America for the first time ever in 1890? The frontier. A line beyond which there was not much settlement. And I can show you, it's kind of cool, this picture here, which I will show you as soon as I unfreeze the artwork. This is a map of population density in the United States, every census from 1790 to 1870. And by and large, in 1790, what can we, and it's not a mathematical line, obviously, but we can pretty much determine that there is a line beyond which there's not a lot of people living. And what happens each successive decade? What happens to the line? It moves further west. But there is always this sense of a line. 1820. This thing doesn't work, of course. Sometimes the line is blazingly visible. I mean, here in 1830, 1840, the line here is kind of the Mississippi River. And if you look at here, the 1860 line is very clear. Look at that. 1870. But then by 1890, you get. We're not, now what Turner is saying, he's not saying there's no place that's not settled, but there's no line that you can't draw, that there's isolated pockets of settlement throughout the entirety of the country by 1890. And to Turner, this is going to have some pretty interesting, there's some pretty interesting causes, consequences, etc. To this fact that the frontier, for the first time in American history, has disappeared. Okay, keep reading.
This great official statement marks the closing of a great historic movement. Up to our own day, American history has been in a large degree the history of colonization of the Great West. The existence of an area of free land, its continuous recession, and the advance of American settlement westward explain American development.
Thank you, Freedom.
Behind institutions, behind constitutional forms and modifications, lie the vital forces that call these organs into life and shape them to meet changing conditions. The peculiarity of American institutions is the fact that they have been compelled to adapt themselves to the changes of an expanding people, to the changes involved in crossing a continent, in winning a wilderness, and in developing each area of its progress out of the primitive economic and political conditions of the frontier into the complexity of city life.
That is the thesis. What is his thesis? What is his, and remember, a thesis is an argumentative point. It is an answer. It is an argument. What is the argument? You have like a tie, a jacket, you look like a schlemazel. Like,
I am, if that's, I don't know what that word means, but I'm pretty sure I'm that. Oh wait, okay. But that's your favorite student.
I like Ryan. So what's the thesis? What's his argumentative point? Don't read the paragraph back to me. Let's look behind institutions, behind constitutional forms and modifications, lie the vital forces that call these organs into life and shape them to meet changing conditions. The peculiarity of American institutions is the fact that they have been compelled to adapt themselves to the changes of an expanding people, to the changes involved in crossing a continent and winning a wilderness, and in developing in each area of this progress out of the primitive economic and political conditions of the frontier into the complexity of city life. What is the thesis here? What is his argumentative point, the core of his essay, Aurelio?
Is it talking about like the American culture or no?
Well, that's what he's talking about. But a thesis is an
That
answer.
is expanding across.
Yeah, but that's a fact. That's not an argument. That the idea that the fact that America has expanded across a continent is not an argumentative point. Okay? That's a fact. People are entitled to their own opinions. They are not entitled to their own facts. That is a fact. It cannot be argued. Americans have spread westward. We have the data to back it up. I'm sorry?
Can I please have your attention? I just wanted to let everybody know in the Humanitarian Club that we will be collecting cans again for the month of January. It will start tomorrow. There will be a box in room 105, and it will end January 21st, before we go on break for Martin Luther King. Thank you.
I'm sorry, Lauren, what did you say?
I said he finds it strange.
He finds what strange?
The fact that we keep changing.
So what word are you kind of like focusing on here?
The one they can't say.
Peculiarity.
Peculiar.
So, yeah, so Lorna's on the right track. She's identified there's something that Turner finds, what's another synonym for peculiar?
Strange.
Strange is what Lorna used.
Weird.
Less
Curious.
uncommon. I like. Strange kind of has a kind of negative connotation with it. Unusual, uncommon, out of the ordinary. So unique. So he's saying what the adjective peculiarity is modifying what noun here? What is he calling peculiar? Our institutions. So he says there's something unique, strange, unusual about our institutions, and what does he say that thing is? What is peculiar about our institutions, Elizabeth?
That we're able to adapt.
That not we're able to adapt, but we have adapted. Why? Because people have been constantly on the move. If we look at France, there's no movement. If you look at Russia, Russia conquers somebody and that, but it's a different movement. Turner says what makes American institutions unusual is that they have adapted because Americans have been moving so much. That's his thesis. Now, what question does it beg? American institutions are strange because we've done so much moving. What's the next question you want to ask? Well, that we know where we were moving. We were moving west. Why are they strange? What's so strange? Why are they unusual? If I came into class and said, "My God, Bob is weird," your first question is going to be, "Why is Bob weird?" American institutions are peculiar. Why? Well, we've been moving so much. Well, let's see what he's going to say made that so unique. Jackie, would you like to read?
Thus, American development has exhibited not merely advance along a single line, but a return to primitive conditions on a continually advancing frontier line, and a new development for that area. American social development has been continually beginning over again on the frontier. This perennial rebirth is fluidly.
This perennial rebirth, this fluidity of American life, this expand. There's a term for that in English that I don't remember, but he's kind of using repetition here to make his point. This perennial rebirth, this fluidity, this expansion does what, Jackie? With its new opportunities.
With its new opportunities, its continuing touch with the simplicity of primitive society, furnish the forces dominating American character.
So there's our verb finally, furnish. So this perennial rebirth furnishes the force. So what creates American culture, he says? What are Americans always doing out on the frontier? Right, but what are they doing in so expanding? Which does, what do they get to do every time they start a new town?
Like they get to like decide how they're gonna do it, so in a way like they get to develop their own.
Yeah, they get to start over. Every time somebody moves out to the frontier, they are creating something new. And that's unusual. We don't normally get to create new things. You know, none of us are ever going to go found a town. We might go live in towns and cities that other people founded, but none of us, in all likelihood, are ever going to go start our own town. But they did back then. Lots. And he says that that is what creates this American character. Anaya, would you read The Frontier is the Line?
The frontier is the line of the most rapid and effective militarization. The wilderness masters the colonists. They find some of European industries, tools, modes of travel, and thought. It takes them from the railroad car and puts him in the birch canoe. It strips off the garments of civilization and arrays him in a hunting shirt and the moccasin. It puts him in the log cabin of the Cherokee and Iroquois. and runs an Indian palisade around him. Before long, he has gone to planting Indian corn and found with a sharp stick. He shouts the war cry and takes a scalpel in orthodox Indian fashion. In short, at the frontier, the environment is at first too strong for the man. He must accept the conditions which it furnishes or perish, and so he fits himself into the Indian clearings and follows the Indian trails. Little by little, he transforms the wilderness, but the outcome is not the old Europe.
Well, that's interesting. So there's a lot of people moving west. Immigrants, migrants, Americans, Europeans. And what does this kind of say? That when you get out to the frontier, what are you? No, when you first arrive there. What does this say? He says it explicitly. When you first get out there.
You're like free.
No, what word does he use? He explicitly says, you get out to the wilderness, it finds him what? He's European. He has European habits, European dress, European industry, European modes of travel, thought, tools, blah, 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 blah. And then what happens? Do those tools, ways of thinking, ways of living work on the frontier? No. On the frontier, what does he have to turn himself into? What does he have to turn himself into? An Indian. He says he becomes an Indian. That he plants Indian corn, plows with a sharp stick, shouts the war cry, takes the scalp in Orthodox Indian fashion. If he doesn't do that, what's going to happen to him? He dies. That the wilderness is too much for him. He has to adapt or die. And most people choose to adapt. But as much as he acts like an Indian, he is not an Indian. What is he? Who is acting? So what is that going to create? Something new. We're going to mix cultures. We're going to, through this movement, mix something together, because he does transform his wilderness, but what comes out is not the same that went in. What comes out, in another word? American. Okay. Stephen, would you read each frontier?
Frontier is traces behind it, and when it becomes a settled area, the region still partakes of the frontier characteristics. Thus, the advance of the frontier has been by a steady movement away from the influence of Europe. A steady growth of independence on the lines, that's a study of disobedience. The men who work under these conditions and to fulfill economical influence for the most of it, they raise to study the really American part of our history.
Steph?
By 1880, the settled around had been pushed into northern Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, along the Dakota rivers, and in the Black Hills region, and was ascending the rivers of Kansas and mines in Colorado had drawn isolated frontier settlements into that region, and Montana and Idaho were receiving settlers. The frontier was found in these mining camps and the ranches of the Great Plains. The superintendent of the census of 1890 reports, as previously stated, that the settlement of the West lies so scattered over the region that there can no longer be said to be a frontier line.
Keep going.
Generally, in
The farmer's advance.
The farmer's advance came in a distinct series of ways. In Peck's New Guide to the West, published in Boston in 1837, occurs this suggestive passage. Generally, in all the Western settlements, three classes, like the waves of the ocean, have rolled one after the other.
All right, so he's going to explain settlement in terms of what? There's three waves that are going to create settlement. Debbie, would you keep reading for us? First comes?
First comes the pioneer, who depends for the subsistence of his family chiefly upon the natural growth of vegetation, called the range, and the proceeds of hunting. His implements of agriculture are rude, chiefly of his own make, and his efforts directed mainly to a crop of corn and a truck patch. He is the occupant for the time being, pays no rent, and feels as independent as the lord of the manor. With a horse, cow, and 1 or 2 breeders of swine, he strikes into the woods with his family and becomes the founder of a new country, or perhaps state.
County.
Oh, county. He builds his cabin, gathers around him a few other families of similar tastes and habits, and occupies till the range is somewhat subdued, and hunting a little precarious, or, which is more frequently the case, till the neighbors crowd around. Roads, bridges, and fields annoy him, and he lacks elbow room. He breaks for the high timber, clears out for the new purchase, or migrates to Arkansas or Texas to work the same process over.
So what's the first group of people? What do we call them? They're the pioneers. The people who set out with their own tools, built their own house, scratched a living out of the soil, and then when did they leave if they decided to leave? Why did they go? It got too crowded. That people came and started, he started, building roads and bridges and planting new fields. He lacked elbow room. When he was out there by himself with a couple other families, he was Lord of the Manor. There was no government. It was his place. And then when civilization kind of started catching up to him, what did he often do? Moved out to another place and started the whole process over again. So who came in second? Debbie, would you keep going?
Okay. The next class of immigrants purchase the lands, add field to field, clear out the roads, throw rough bridges over the stream, set up hewn log houses with glass windows and brick or stone chimneys, occasionally plant orchards, build mills, schoolhouses, courthouses, etc., and exhibit the picture and forms of plain, frugal, civilized life.
So kind of the image that I have in my head is what kind of colonial America looked like. Simple houses, a church, a school, a mill, farms, dirt roads, little wooden bridges. It's civilization. There's judges, and there, you elect the legislature to represent you. What's lacking here? Now let's see what comes next. Let me see what might be lacking. James, would you read?
Another wave rolls on. The men of capital and enterprise come. The settler is ready to sell out and take the advantage of the rise in property, push farther into the interior and become himself a man of capital and enterprise in turn. The small village rises to a spacious town or city. Substantial edifices of brick, extensive fields, orchards, gardens, colleges, and churches are seen. Broadcloth, silks, leghorns, crepes, and all the refinements, luxuries,
frivolities,
and fashions are in vogue. Thus wave after wave is rolling westward. The real El Dorado is still further on. A portion of the 2 first classes remains stationary amidst the general movement, improve their habits and condition, and rise in the scale of society.
So what's the last group of people that rolls in? Elites. People that create and bring art and fashion and culture and colleges and beautiful churches and factories and all the things that make for city life. Now it says and in the last part, a portion of the first 2 classes remain. Some of the people from the second class they sell, they make a profit off of what the more elite people are willing to pay, and they move further west and become elites themselves. And this according to Turner, is how settlement works. You start with pioneers, then you have a little town full of hardworking farmers, and then eventually, many of the towns, get factories and elites and culture and art and all those nice, fancy, schmancy things. And so on and so forth over a period of hundreds and hundreds of pounds across the continent. Sandra.
Having now roughly outlined the various kinds of frontiers and their modes of advance, chiefly from the point of view of the frontier itself, we may next inquire what what were the influences on the East and on the Old World. A rapid enumeration of some of the more noteworthy effects is all that I have time for. First, we note that the frontier promoted the formation of a composite nationality for the American people.
Okay, hang on there. That's really key. What is a composite nationality? What is a composite?
Solid. Is it like solid?
Composite. What a composite is? If I'm writing, if I decide I want to write a book on Elizabeth High School, but I don't want to name names, I might say I'm going to take, you know, a little bit of Naomi, just a little piece of Naomi's character, and I'm going to take a little piece of Nelsie's character, a little piece of Lorna's, and a little piece of Sandra's, bring them together, and I create a person called Jane. Jane is a composite character. She's a combination that people came, different disparate pieces came together to create a composite. So, what is a composite nationality?
It's composed of many pieces.
Exactly. It's a nationality composed of many pieces. Now, we know this to be true, that by the 1890s out in the West, you have English and Germans and Irish and Norwegians and Swedes and Finns and French and Dutch, and by the 1890s you have Poles and Russians and Jews. And what do they all do? They mix. It's the melting pot. The composite nationality is the melting pot, exactly. And why does this work better on the frontier than back east in Boston?
You're starting from anyway, so it's like you don't have anything established for like have a standard for.
Yeah, that's a good answer. That there's also not that many people out there. If I'm Hans, the 19-year-old German behind the plow, and there's only 5 neighbors, and one of them happens to be, you know, Elsa the Norwegian, well, guess what? Hans the German and Elsa the Norwegian will form the horizontal hula. Yes, Joe? Yeah, absolutely. There's less social norms compared back east. It's an excellent point. And we're going to talk about that too. That back east, where there's, you know, established churches and hierarchies and people have been doing things for this way for a long time, there's a lot more restrictions on that sort of thing. But out on the frontier, you know, you meet, you mix, and you get this composite nationality that, you know, by the time a generation or two goes by, you know, you don't even know which of your nationalities you're supposed to fit into. This is a fact of movement. The coast was preponderantly English, but later ties of continental immigration flowed across the free lands. This was the case from earlier colonial days. And folks, to understand how true this is, just think of your own, think for a moment about your own families who have been, for the last generation or 3, in a state, most of you, of serious movement. And I bet if you consider your family members have married, produced children, gone out with people from a lot wider range of ethnicities and nationalities than would have been the case if you stayed wherever it is you came from. Think about if you were all out on the front, if you right now married your crush, or the guy or the girl that you were going out with. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that there is quite a diverse range of ethnicities and nationalities that you guys, if we just said, all right, everyone at Upper has to marry somebody from Upper. Like, you would have, first of all, there's a lot more girls, so. In Uruguay, most people who live in Uruguay are going to marry an Uruguayan. Most, not all, but most. But you bring that person to Elizabeth, they might marry someone from Uruguay, but it's very possible they'll marry someone whose family is Cuban, Mexican, Dominican, Venezuelan, Irish, Italian, Black. Sure. This is what happens. This is what happens when people move. And it happened in American history from the very beginning, that this composite nationality appeared. I don't have a ton of time. They're good. I like them. I gotta get back to them. You know, but let's catch up, okay? We'll talk. All right. It's good seeing you. All right. Now, so our first thing is the presence of the frontier. If we're listing things here, the presence of the frontier led to this composite nationality. Let's see what else it led to. Keep reading, whoever we're reading. It was Sandra. Sandra, I'm on the top of the third page. It was this nationalizing tendency.
It was this nationalizing tendency of the West that transformed the democracy of Jefferson into the national republicanism of Monroe and the democracy of Andrew Jackson. The West of the world was 1812, the West of Clay, and Benton and Harrison, and Andrew Jackson, shut off by the middle states in the mountains from the coast sections, had a solidarity of its own with the national tendencies. On the tide of the father of waters,
Mississippi River. That's just a poetic name for the Mississippi River, the father of waters.
North and South met and mingled into a nation.
Keep going.
But the most important effect of the frontier has been in the promotion of democracy here and Europe. As has been indicated, the frontier is productive of individualism. Complex society is precipitated by the wilderness into a kind of primitive organization based on the family. The tendency is antisocial. It produces antipathy to control, and particularly to any direct control. The tax gatherer is viewed as a representative of oppression.
Okay, yeah, here we got some really important stuff also. Out on the frontier, who rules you? You. Yourself. That guy who pushes out onto the frontier, there's no government out there, it's him. And a couple other people and families he chooses to live with. What sort of person do you think does that in the first place? What sort of person pushes out, you know, and leaves again when it gets too crowded and there's too many bridges and roads?
A nomad.
What kind of character does that person have? It's a person who doesn't like to be told what. And what to do, and what to think, and how to be. In a lot of ways. This is from your original American pioneers. What this is saying, you have a large group of people who move to a certain place because they are motivated by a desire to get away from what? Being told what to do. Now, can we link that idea to the change from Jefferson's democracy to Jackson's democracy? Can we link Jeffersonian democracy to Jacksonian democracy with this idea of a whole bunch of people who are extreme individualists that are antisocial, that do not like to be told what to do. Who wants to go at this? This would show some understanding of Jeffersonianism and Jacksonianism. Hey, what do you know? Go ahead. What do you know?
Wait, Jackson was really governor. And Jefferson was ruler.
What do we know? See if we can kind of mentally think this through.
They treated, like, not the lower class, but not the elites. So the common man.
Thomas Jefferson is an example of what? He's an elite. There's your facts, make your connection now. All these people who moved out west, one of the reasons they moved out west is what did they get tired of? Of this elite telling them what to do. They move out west for lots of reasons. One of them is to be free of people telling them what to do. And in so doing, they find their hero in Jackson, who says, vote for me, and the elite bankers, the elite politicians, the elite merchants will no longer have influence over your life. One of the reasons we move from Jefferson to Jackson is because by the age of Jackson, there are people in the West. What sort of people? Well, pioneers and these early settlers. People who move out there because they don't like people telling them what to do. Is there still, well, let's wait for that question. Antisocial produces antipathy. It produces antipathy to control and particularly to direct control. The tax gatherer is an agent, a representative of oppression. Where do we see that in American history? In what? In colonial times. Why did we get rid of the British? Because they were telling us what to do. Why did the Puritans leave England in 1620? Because the English church was telling them what to do. People don't like to be, especially the people that founded and built America. And that's what Turner is saying. Turner is saying this is a country founded and built by people who don't like to be told what to do. He's not saying it's good or bad, he's just saying it is. It's a country founded by people who don't like elites telling us what to do, what to think, what to believe. And the frontier has always offered an opportunity for people to get away from elites and an opportunity to create society new. The next paragraph explains how more democracy was pushed by the western sections of the country, and then the next paragraph, so long as free land exists, is important. I'm going to read it. So long as free land exists, the opportunity for incompetency exists, and economic power secures political power. But the democracy born of free land, strong in selfishness and individualism, intolerant of administrative experience and education, and pressing individual liberty beyond its proper bounds, has its dangers as well as its benefits. Now there is an interesting sentence. How many of you have ever ignored a warning label? We love this. Do not operate heavy machinery. That's for people who don't know the hell they're talking about. You know, do not dive into the pool. That's for people who don't know how to swim. Bike helmet, schmike helmet. I know how to ride my damn bike. It's for little kids. I shouldn't eat this much McDonald's. Screw that. What the hell they have to tell me about my life?
Don't eat them. Don't eat them. Do not like them.
Yeah, dude. Think about all of the warning labels. Now, who's here ever been to the side of a pool that says 3 feet 6 inches, do not dive, and have dived in anyway? And Deontay. Now, let's establish something here. There's a lot of people with a lot of degrees after their name that went to very nice colleges that did a lot of statistical research on what happens when, bodies of this mass jump into water of that depth, and they talked to doctors who have seen spinal cord injuries, and they did statistical analysis, and a lot of educated people did a lot of educated things for the guy to write, do not dive. Well, here comes Deontay. I don't know what the hell they're talking about, I can swim, and dive in he does. This is individualism. This is Deontay pretty much flipping the bird to what Turner calls here intolerant of administrative experience and education. We all know you should wear a helmet when you go out biking. We all know you shouldn't be eating McDonald's 3 times a week. We all know that you shouldn't be drinking as much as you do, and guess what? We do it anyway. Why? Because it's the same idea. I don't want to be told what to do. It's a very, very deeply rooted American trait, says Turner. And it comes from the Puritans, people who did not want to be told how to live, what to do. And this idea had always been reestablished out on the frontier, where if you didn't like people telling you what to do, you can just move somewhere else. This plays, and I kind of now want to talk about what Jill said earlier. This is truly what culture is. And what I mean by culture goes beyond, the food we eat and the dances we dance and stuff. But I'm going to bet that if you come back 15 years from now at your 15-year high school reunion, a very big chunk of you will be working in states that are not New Jersey. You will leave your parents behind and you will chase economic opportunity across the country. I will go out, maybe your parents will then follow you, but you will be the leader of that. You will get the job in Texas, in North Carolina, in Georgia, in Florida. And you will say, you know what, I'm doing what's best for me, and I'm going. And Mom, I love you, and you're welcome to come when you and Dad retire, but I'm out. Yeah. How different is that than the guy who says, I'm off to the frontier? I bet that very, very few of you would allow your parents to veto the choice of who you marry. I'm also going to bet you that many of you will end up marrying a person that either your parents or your grandparents might not love the ethnicity, sexual orientation, or race of the person you choose to marry. I bet you that happens to a lot of you. That's culture. More and more, if you look, more and more Americans are marrying outside of their race, their ethnicity, their religion. Guys, here's an interesting fact. Elizabeth 100 years ago, an Irish guy and an Italian girl, that's a scandal. That Irish dad does not want his daughter marrying Italian. What's wrong with you? But now that's so ordinary, it doesn't even bother you, it doesn't even register. It's sitting there, it just goes white. But you understand And the point I'm trying to make is that that has to come from somewhere. That has to come from millions of individuals saying, my individualism, my autonomy is more important than my family, my parents, what my grandmother thinks. And that's a choice that people in other parts of the world don't make like we make. That's culture. And what Turner says is that individualism, don't tread on me, leave me the hell alone, is a very American thing that was aided and abetted and created by this frontier. Out on the frontier, it's a lot easier to marry somebody different than back in Boston. It's that frontier culture that has become a very important part of who we are. I'm sure all of you right now are thinking, well, what would Grandma think if I brought such and such home? But for very, very few of you will that determine who you actually bring home. You'd rather choose to battle your parents than not do what you want. That's kind of what Turner's saying here. What else did he say? Let's see. Individualism in America. You want to talk about a negative thing? I think if you try to understand why America is a significantly more violent place than most of the world industrial, I think that comes to the same thing. Leave me the hell alone, or I'll shoot you. I think our violence comes from a lot of, and I don't think you can have one without the other. They kind of go, what Turner would say is they kind of go hand in hand. That you just can't, if you get rid of the bad, you're accidentally going to also get rid of a lot of the good. You're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's the old expression. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like you obviously want to throw the bathwater out because it's old and dirty, but don't throw the baby out with it also. I always had this mental image of like a baby fly out of the Individualism in America has allowed a laxity in regard to governmental affairs, which has rendered possible the spoils system and all the manifest evils that follow from the lack of a highly developed civic spirit. In this connection may be noted also the influence of frontier conditions on permitting lax business honor, inflated paper currency, and wildcat banking. All of the bad financial stuff that comes from people kind of saying, hey, what am I going to get out of this? The charlatan, the huckster, people who make a living tricking other people out of their money. Well, you know what P.T. Barnum said, the guy who found Barnum Valley Circus, one of the coolest American stories, just a prototypical American, said, there's a sucker born every minute. One time there's a story, P.T. Barnum hired 4 guys, and they walked in a giant square in Boston, each carrying a brick. And every time they walked to one corner of the square, they put the brick down. And picked up another one and walked to the other corner of the square and put the brick down. And a crowd of people gathers around, pretty much saying, what in God's name are you doing? And it was from there that P.T. Barnum announced his, next great thing, and people had to pay to go in and see what P.T. did. That's how P.T. Barnum got people's attention. He just walked people around with bricks for an hour, making a giant crowd of people, which he then pretty much took a nickel from each of them and made off with a small fortune. That's brilliant. It's of questionable morality, but it's brilliant as hell. Why do you think, I'm going to leave us with this. Why do this is a very strange part of American culture. When we watch mob movies, we root for the mobsters. When we watch Bonnie and Clyde, we root for Bonnie and Clyde. When we watch Goodfellas, Godfather, Sopranos, we are rooting for these awful murderous crooks. Why? And my answer to that But that's not hope. My answer, in a normal society, in a just society, we would not be rooting for Tony Soprano. Tony Soprano is an awful murderer. But we end up rooting for him because I think it speaks to that part of us that still says, leave me the hell alone, don't tell me what to do. And now, I'm going to leave you with, so what Turner says is he kind of has 2 points that he wants to make. One, is that spirit of the frontier going to disappear now that there's no frontier? Now that, if you were a weirdo in Europe, you went to Massachusetts. If you were a weirdo in Massachusetts, you went to Rhode Island. If you were a weirdo in Rhode Island, you went to New York. If you were there was always somewhere for the people who didn't quite fit in to go. What happens when there's nowhere for them to go anymore? What happens when we have to start to deal with those people who would have just gone out to the frontier? We have to deal with them in our everyday lives. And that's kind of a tough question to answer. Turner kind of posits that. Like, stop packing up. I'm not done. So, what happens when there's no safety valve in the country? Now, when things weren't good, when people didn't have economic opportunity, they just went west. What's going to happen now that that safety valve is not there? And the other question he asks is American culture going to retain that same sense of independence without a frontier? I think we've retained some of it, but I also think we've lost a lot of it, which is why we all go around wearing helmets when we fight. Davy Crockett would not have worn a helmet. So it's an interesting thesis, and I want you to think of it in terms of identity, and we're going to see that identity change in the rest of this block. That's why I chose to do it the first day. Any questions on Turner, the West, crazy Americans who don't like to be told what to do? Don't tread on me. Yeah, this is going to segue into negative liberty, we'll talk about later this week.